Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to get started. My name is Faith Hillis. I'm the director of CEERES, which has sponsored this event. And it's my great honor today to introduce Eugene Finkel, who will be discussing his new book, Intent to Destroy Russia's 200-Year Quest to Dominate Ukraine. Eugene Finkel is the Kenneth H. Keller Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. His most recent book is Intent to Destroy, and he's also the author of Ordinary Jews' Choice and Survival During the Holocaust, as well as the co-author of 2 other books. He's also published articles and op-eds in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and other outlets. After giving a short presentation of the book, Finkel will be in conversation with our own Scott Gehlbach. Scott is the Elise and Jack Lipsey Professor in the Department of Political Science, the Harris School of Public Policy, and the College at the University of Chicago. A scholar of authoritarian and post-authoritarian regimes, much of Gehlbach's research is motivated by the contemporary and historical experience of Russia and Ukraine. An early and leading practitioner of the use of game theory to model the institutions of authoritarian regimes, Gehlbach is the author of the widely used textbook, Formal Models of Domestic Politics, now in its 2nd edition. For those joining online on Zoom, we welcome your question as well. You can ask a question via the Q&A, and we will be sure to reserve ample time for conversation after the talk. Thank you again to Eugene and to Scott.
It's an honor and a pleasure being here. So what I will be doing today, so I will first present the book relatively shortly, and then we'll have a conversation and the Q&A. So I will be talking to this face that on my most recent book, Intent to Destroy. It's available here. So if you like the talk, I hope you buy the book. Even if you don't like the talk, I still hope you buy the book. At best, it will convince you that I'm right despite the talk. At worst, you will find more stuff not to like. So the book came out in November last year. Here is the British edition on the left and the US edition and on the right. You decide which one is more macabre, but I think they both convey what I want to understand in this book. The book is not an academic manuscript. It was written for a general public. And you know, when I was writing this book, the working title was To Kill Ukraine. Eventually, the publisher decided that it sounds too much like a do-it-yourself manual, so they settled on Intent to Destroy. But essentially, that's what I try to understand in this book. Russian violence against civilians in Ukraine and Russian violence in and against Ukraine. And when I started writing this book, I was mostly trying to understand something that did not make sense to me. And that's the violence against civilians since the beginning of Russian full-scale invasion in February 22. If you follow the news about the war, then of course you know that violence against civilians is a key feature of this war. Bucha, Mariupol, but also more gruesome stuff like mass executions, rape, beheadings, impaling heads on sticks, castrating live POWs with box cutters. And that did not make much sense if you compared what was happening on the ground with the Russian official rhetoric, official narrative of the war, especially during the first couple of months, that it was essentially a war of liberation of oppressed Russian speakers of Ukraine who are being mistreated by the Kiev neo-Nazi regime. So I'm not an historian, I'm a political scientist, but I still know enough about history of wars to tell you that true, genuine liberation typically does not involve mass executions of people you are liberating. So I try to make sense of this puzzle, of this lack of mismatch between the rhetoric and the facts on the ground. And as I started writing it, I realized that, I can't start the story in February 22 and not even in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass. I had to go back in time, and I went back and back in time until I became a wannabe historian and had to write a book that covered the last 200 years. So I do talk about the current war in the book, and I will be more than happy to talk about it during the Q&A, but the focus shifted from the current war to the longer arc of Russian-Ukrainian relations and Russian attempts to dominate and control the area that is now Ukraine, and people who live there, not just ethnic Ukrainians, and how they try to do it mostly peacefully, but also more than willing to use violence, large-scale violence, when they could not achieve their goals through peaceful means. But since we're at the university, before I present you the main argument, let's do a short quiz. So here are 3 quotes. How many of them belong to Putin? And if not all 3, then which ones? So 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. Actually, just the first one. Yeah. The first one is Putin's famous article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians from summer 2021, when he told us his views on Ukraine and was essentially telling us, that's what what I think, so you make your own decisions. And we said, no, he doesn't really mean it. Well, apparently he meant it. What are the other 2? The other 2 also come from Russian leaders. So the second one is Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, Grand Duke Nicholas, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army during World War I, just before the Russian army invaded Austro-Hungary in August 1914. The second one is Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Molotov-Ribbentrop fame, justifying the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, when Hitler and Stalin decided to carve up Europe. So what we have here are 3 almost identical arguments by very different Russian leaders, Imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet. And what I try to understand in this book is why the rhetoric is so similar, what drives those continuities, and also how this rhetoric, how those ideas translate into actions on the ground. So just let me give you the argument in a nutshell. And if you know anything about Russia and Ukraine, it probably will not come as a surprise to you at many of the things that I say, but I won't assume that all of you here know this history, so let me go through it. So the argument is, in a nutshell, is that over the last 200 years, with some brief interruptions in 1920s and 1990s, controlling and dominating Ukraine was a key goal of Imperial Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet Russian governments. And there is a discussion, both among my colleagues in social sciences, but also among policymakers, think tankers, journalists. Well, what is driving it? Is it about identity or is it about security? Well, the fact is that, for me at least, it's both. It's a mix, though, and both identity and security are present. And at different points in time, those 2 factors will have different weight, but almost always it's neither just identity nor just security. It's both, though identity is more important. So let's start with identity. What are we talking about? And again, I feel, like an interloper describing this here, since you have one of the best experts on the Russian imperial and nationalist ideas here in this room, Faith. So again, I apologize for doing it, but I will do it nonetheless. So the identity argument is 3-pronged. First, both Russia and Ukraine trace their history to Kievan Rus, a medieval Slavic state that encompassed most of modern Ukraine, Western Russia, Belarus. In the 30th century, it was destroyed by a Mongol invasion. The western parts, which are now Ukraine, were quickly absorbed by Poland and Lithuania. The eastern part went to the Mongols, and out of those eastern parts, Moscow emerged from a pretty insignificant principality to an imperial power, large, dynamic, ambitious, but also driven by an idea that Moscow is a natural heir to Kiev and has a natural right to dominate all those lands. The second prong of this identity belief is the idea that the Russian people consist of 3 branches: the Great Russians, or just Russians, the Little Russians, who are the Ukrainians, and the White Russians, Belarusians. Now, Great and Little Russians also imply hierarchical relationship, right? It wasn't meant to be this way originally. It was originally used as simply geographic terms. But once you start talking about Great and Little Russians, then this hierarchical relationship simply has to rise, and that's what happened. So a lot of the Russian reactions, especially among the nationalists to Ukraine trying to go its own way, can simply boils down to how dare you? Who you think you are to defy, the older brother who needs to be in charge. And the third prong is that all those three branches have only one language for literature, science, administration, and that's, of course, Russian. Ukrainian is just a vernacular, a peasant dialect. And using Ukrainian for literature, for science, is simply a waste of time and resources, and nobody should be doing it. And again, most people who know something about Russia and Ukraine are aware of those points. They're staples of Russian official historiography. What most people do not realize is how recent those ideas are. And they're essentially a product of 19th century struggle between the Russian Empire and the Polish national movement. Why? Because when Russia, Prussia, and Austria partitioned Poland out of existence, the part that is now Ukraine and Belarus went to the Russian Empire, and with that, the Romanovs inherited the nobility, which was almost exclusively Polish and Catholic, and pretty large Polish urban middle class. And those dreamt of restoring Polish independence, and with the Polish independence, also the territory that belonged to the Polish state, which is Ukrainian. There were several bloody uprisings, the most notable in 1830s and 1863, 1864. And the Russian government feared that local Polish elites might corrupt the peasants who are Orthodox, who are the Little Russians, and turn them into Catholic, into Poles. So from the 1830s, there is a very intensive program by the imperial government of emphasizing the Russianness of the region, which in 1860s switches to a campaign of forced Russification. Essentially, people in this region have to become Russians without adjectives. Not Little Russians anymore, but just Russians, switch to Russian. The Ukrainian language is largely banned. There is a campaign to Russify the region, and that's how we get from identity to security, because those are here constantly mixed. On top of the fear of the Poles, there is a national security component. So there is a wonderful history of Ukraine by Harvard professor Serhiy Plotny with the title The Gates of Europe, because that's essentially what Ukraine is. And some gates open both ways, and Ukraine is one of those gates. So historically, most of the Western invasions of Russia came through Ukraine, and the Russian and the Soviet governments were always concerned about Ukraine for its national security value, because there are natural defenses between Ukraine and the rest of Europe, the Pripyat marshes, the Carpathian Mountains. It's largely an open steppe between Ukraine and Russia proper. And even more importantly, there is the regime security component. Nothing scares a Russian autocrat than a democratic Ukraine, because if those are the same people, and if Ukrainians manage to build a democratic state, then God forbid Russians might want the same as well. Now, it's a catch-22 situation. You can get out of it quite easily by saying, well, actually, Russians and Ukrainians are not the same people, but that would undermine the identity basis of the regime. So they're stuck in this fear of Ukraine going its own way and building a democracy, because Russians might want to have the same. And again, historically, many subversive democratic revolutionary ideas came to Moscow and St. Petersburg through what is true or from what is now Ukraine. And my final point is that violence and repression are pretty costly. So while the imperial or the Soviet or the Russian governments would very much want to control Ukraine, they would rather do it on the cheap, without using much violence. And for that, the Russian and the Soviet governments. And here again, I apologize for using those interchangeably and using mostly Russian government when I refer to the Soviets. So keep that in mind. For that, the Russian and the Soviet governments quite successfully used what they called a divide and repress strategy, leveraging an extreme heterogeneity of Ukraine, because Ukraine is historically an extremely diverse place. You know, when I started listing all the major ethnic groups that called Ukraine home, the list in the book went to something like 3 or 4 lines of text. Now, of course, this diversity has diminished, but it still remains an exceptionally diverse place. So what the government did is mercilessly repressing groups that at any given time were considered a threat to the regime or to the government, while at the same time protecting and promoting other groups who would use as local agents, who would provide local knowledge, who would provide the main power, who would do most of the work of governing Ukraine on behalf of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the result was that at any given time in Ukraine, there were groups that were repressed, but there were also groups, local Ukrainian groups, not ethnically Ukrainian, but groups in Ukraine that were protected, that were well off, and that were pretty happy with being ruled by Moscow and St. Petersburg. And over time, those groups changed. Sometimes when needed, it could be the traditional Cossack elites. Sometimes that could be the Russian-speaking urban working class. Sometimes it could be minorities such as Jews. The point is that that Moscow and St. Petersburg always knew how to leverage those differences, those cleavages within Ukraine, and use this divide and repress strategy. What explained the invasion in 2022, in my view, is that for the first time in history, this divide and repress strategy has failed. That for the first time, especially since 2014 and the Russian annexation in Crimea, we see an emergence of a truly national civic Ukrainian identity where your region or your ethnicity or your religion are less important than commitment to Ukraine as a state, to Ukraine as a national idea. Now, I'm not trying to say that suddenly, since 2014, Ukraine has become a monolithic nation. Of course, or that old cleavages disappeared, or that everyone is Ukraine is a liberal Democrat, or that there is no far right in Ukraine. Of course, that's not the case. But still, the point is that for the vast majority of Ukrainians, now Ukraine means something as a state, as a national idea, rather than an ethnic identity. Partly it's just a result of the annexation of Crimea. Many people in Ukraine were genuinely offended by what Russia did, especially in the eastern parts of Ukraine and among the people who spoke Russian and were traditionally more sympathetic towards Russia. Many of them took it very personally. In part, it's just inertia. Right? Ukraine is an independent state since 1992, so the younger generations, they don't know any other state. And so Zelensky and I were born in the same year. Soviet Union collapsed when we were 14. For us, we have zero nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and those generations simply do not know any other state. And they also know what Russia has become, and they do not want this future or this reality for themselves and their children. So while Putin would have liked to control Ukraine de facto and turn it into a client state a la Belarus, he simply could not, because the proposition was not attractive enough for most Ukrainians. And that explains the invasion and trying to control Ukraine by force. And that, I think, also explains, to a large degree, the violence against civilians. And here I'm making a leap of faith because we still don't have too much data, but we already have more than enough anecdotal data to make some inferences. And from what I saw going through, intercepted conversations of Russian soldiers, reading the few documents that do exist, is that Russians were so So Russian soldiers who went to Ukraine were so convinced in those identity parts of the narrative that they did genuinely expect to be greeted as liberators. And when that did not happen, and when instead of welcoming ceremonies, they got resistance, the perception of Ukrainians switched from brothers to not even enemies. With enemies you fight, but you can understand it. Worse than enemies, traitors. And the key driver of the violence against civilians, in my view, is revenge. Now, how those ideas, those identity and security components work in practice, how do they lead to action? So in the book, I talk about several episodes. Here, I want to zoom in on one period that is barely known even in Ukraine itself, and that's the Russian occupation of Austro-Hungarian Galicia and Bukovina during World War I. And very few people, even in Ukraine, know the history of what was happening there. I mean, I'm from this region, so we're talking about this part of Ukraine. I'm from here, I'm from Lviv. My great-grandparents lived through Russian occupation of Galicia. I knew nothing, like almost zero of this history when I came to it. So, but it turned out to be extremely, extremely important to understanding my story. So what was going on there? Well, after the partition of Poland, this region, Galicia and Bukovina, it remains the only part where Ukrainians live in large numbers and is not controlled by the Russian Empire. While in the Russian Empire, Ukrainian language and national identity is repressed, Austro-Hungary is driven by, their guiding principle is ethnic tolerance. So Ukrainians are allowed to have their schools, to have their parties, to have their clubs, to publish books, then get smuggled to Russia. And from the Russian perspective, it's a mortal danger for several reasons. One is that they fear that in addition to books and newspapers, Austro-Hungarians and Germans will also start sending spies across the borders, and they did send spies across the borders, so it wasn't far-fetched. But even more importantly, they perceive this enclave of Ukrainian identity as a mortal danger to the empire and to the Russian nation itself. Why? Because in early 20th century, the nature of Russian politics switches and mass politics, elections, parties become more important. They have the censuses, they know the numbers. If those people in Ukraine are Little Russians, then Great Russians, Belarusians, and Little Russians together are about 2/3 of the empire's population. If those people, those Little Russians, are not Russians anymore, but something else, the share of Russians in their own empire goes to about 45, 46%. In other words, Russians become a minority in their own state, and it worries the government in St. Petersburg hugely. So what do they do to deal with this threat? Well, first, they start cultivating and promoting local pro-Russian people in Galicia. They start finding newspapers, clubs, parties, and even back then, 1913, 1912, there are people in Galicia who are screaming bloody murder. It should not be allowed because look what they're doing. They're finding people, and then they will say that those people are oppressed, and they will attack to protect them, which was the Russian justification in 1914, in 1922. The second prong of the Russian government is to beef up anti-Ukrainian propaganda, claim that Ukraine is a fake identity. It's an anti-Russian idea. It's a conspiracy. The entire idea of Ukraine is a conspiracy to harm Russia. There are literally people in the Austrian Army General Staff, the intelligence division, working day and night, creating the Ukrainians. And this rhetoric is, and of course, they're funded by the Jews, because you cannot leave the Jews out of the story. And if you look at the Russian rhetoric, it's the same rhetoric right now, just instead of Austrians and Germans, it's the Brits or the Americans or the Anglo-Saxons. They really hate the Anglo-Saxons. So the war begins, It doesn't go that well for the Austrians, and by early September, Russian troops occupy most of Galicia and Bukovina. I already showed you the quote from Grand Duke Nicholas. For the Tsar himself, there is no Galicia, there is just one great Russia, and annexing those regions will allow Russia to reach its natural borders. And obviously nobody cares about what people in Galicia and Bukovina think. If St. Petersburg decided that they're Russians, then they are Russians and nothing else matters. When Russian troops occupy Galicia, the immediate inclination is to annex the region, not even wait until the war is over, immediate annexation. And it's not just the nationalists and the monarchists who want to do it. The Constitutional Democrats, the main liberal party in Russia at the time, are also fully on board with this idea. They decide that they're going to wait with the annexation until the war is over formally, but de facto, this region is going to be governed as it is Russian. Now, what being governed as it is Russian means for Galicia and Bukovina? Well, first, it means a massive wave of violence against civilians, mostly, though not only Jews. It also means plunder by Russian troops of pretty much everything that can be stolen, and sometimes things that cannot be stolen as well. So the most bizarre story I came across here in Chernivtsi, where a Russian cavalry unit destroyed the specimen collection of the zoology department. They broke the jars in which the specimens were preserved and drank the alcohol. But other than that, pretty much everything goes. It means a very targeted attack against anyone who is associated with Ukrainian identity. So teachers, activists, writers, elites, they're all arrested, exiled, some of them killed. The head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Metropolite Sheptitsky, is exiled into Russia proper. And instead of local leaders, they start bringing officials and bureaucrats from Russia proper to run the region according to the Russian law. They changed the language of local administration to Russian, even though almost no one in the region speaks Russian. They changed the alphabet from Latin to Cyrillic. They started changing the names of streets to those of Russian leaders. They even changed the time zone to that of St. Petersburg. They also cracked down on the Russian language. All publications in Ukrainian are banned, books are destroyed. You can't publish anything, not even fairy tales or calendars. You can't even send letters because postal censors are instructed to destroy all correspondence in Ukrainian. German, the language of the enemy, is fine. Polish is fine. Czech is fine. Romanian is fine. Only two languages are banned, Ukrainian and Yiddish. They close all Ukrainian language schools. They eliminate all the Ukrainian history classes at the University of Lviv. Eventually, they reopen some Ukrainian schools, but only at the elementary level. Above that, teachers are forced to switch to Russian, and they start sending teachers from Russia proper to teach Ukrainians according to the Russian curriculum. And there is a campaign of forced conversion from Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and most people in Galicia, not in Bukovina, they're Orthodox, but in Galicia, most Ukrainians are Greek Catholic. So there is a very concentrated campaign to convert them to the Orthodox Church. And again, the goal is very explicit: annexation, Russification, destruction of all features of Ukrainian identity. And in that, the occupation of Galicia is actually quite different from the Russian occupations elsewhere, like East Prussia or Caucasus, which were brutal, violent, but there was no attempt to annex. There is no attempt to remake the region. Now, this occupation is over in 1914, and both empires collapsed and many other horrible things happened during World War I. So this episode is not that known, and actually the entire Eastern Front of World War I is not that well known, especially in the West, so most people have forgotten about it. But if you look at what Russia is doing right now in the occupied territories in the east and the south of Ukraine, those would be pretty much the same policies. And for me, it was a schizophrenic experience writing in 2023 when in the morning I would work with, historical documents, read memoirs, newspapers about what was going on in Galicia at that time. And in the afternoon, I read the news and see literally the same policies to the T. The only thing that would differ is the place and the time. But other than that, pretty much the same things that were happening in 1914, 1915 in Galicia and Bukovina happening right now in eastern and southern Ukraine, with two exceptions. There are no anti-Jewish pogroms because there are no Jews left, and the forced conversion campaign is not as powerful, although there is still an attempt to force all Ukrainians to switch to the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, and very severe persecution of Protestant groups. But other than that, it's pretty much identical policies. Now, I'm not saying that the Kremlin is explicitly or deliberately taking out of retirement policies that they used 100 years ago. In fact, I'm pretty sure no one in the Kremlin actually knows what the Russians did in Galicia back then. My argument is different. My argument is that because the ideas, the perceptions, and the goals remain the same over time, they lead to pretty similar policies that we see across very different regimes and very different periods. However, I also don't want to say that the story is deterministic. Obsession with Ukraine is a choice. It's not a destiny for the Kremlin or St. Petersburg. And there were periods in which Russian leaders made different choices. They failed, but I think it's important to understand what they did and why they failed when they tried to win themselves of this extreme focus on Ukraine. And for me, the most important period is Yeltsin's Russia, 1990s. So I will talk briefly about that, probably within 5 minutes. I don't need more than that. So what's going on there? Well, Russia and Ukraine become independent state in 1992, and Yeltsin, he should be criticized for many things, but at least when it came to Ukraine, he instinctively understood that for Russia to become a normal post-imperial state, they need to have Ukraine independent. Most people in Russia still do not perceive Ukraine as a real state, but they're too busy trying to survive. So there is a moment of opportunity to create a different story of what Russia is and the relations between Russia and Ukraine. The liberals who are in power, they also want to build a democratic, peaceful Russia, which is not a threat to itself or its neighbors. So what do they do to create this different identity story of Russia? The answer is nothing. Why? Because most of them are economists. They're not even thinking in those terms. Again, their heart is in the right place. They just don't know how to approach it, and it's not something on their agenda. Instead, they believe that the way to build this democratic, peaceful Russia is to invest in market reforms, and then markets and institutions will bring prosperity, and prosperity will enshrine democracy, and democratic Russia will be peaceful. The problem is that once those market reforms, instead of prosperity, bring misery, there is no reason for the average Russian to go along with the idea of this prosperous, or so not prosperous, but sorry, liberal and democratic Russia. So the opposition, on the other hand, the so-called red-browns, red for the communists, browns for the fascists, they are not in power. They're not really thinking, or they're not allowed anywhere near economic decision-making. Instead, identity is the only thing that they're talking about. And here, for all of them, no matter who they are, Russia controlling Ukraine is a starting point to something else. For the communists, they want to recreate the Soviet Union. And for that, you need to bring Ukraine back, because the Soviet Union collapsed mainly because Ukraine voted for independence. They don't want to recreate the Soviet Union with the Tajikistans and the Uzbekistans. They need Ukraine. The conservatives. Here, the two, I think, most interesting figures is Solzhenitsyn, who is absolutely revered in the West for his opposition to communism, but he was also a pretty radical Russian nationalist. He wanted to create Russia as a state that would encompass Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, northern Kazakhstan. For him, if Ukrainians are crazy enough to try independence, let them do it, but with a caveat. They should do it within their true, quote unquote, ethnographic borders, meaning without eastern and southern Ukraine, and of course without Crimea. They should belong to Russia. He's talking about Ukraine stealing those territories. And in fact, since late 1980s, he's talking quite openly about the possibility of war between Russia and Ukraine. Back then, no one took him that seriously, but he was quite prophetic in this sense. Yuri Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow, probably the second most powerful politician in the country, he manages to get himself declared persona non grata in Ukraine for going to Crimea and saying Crimea should belong to Russia. He also tried to build a bridge that would connect mainland Russia to Crimea without even notifying the Ukrainian government. So once Kiev got wind of this plan, they all obviously shut it down. But the bridge was pretty much the first thing that Putin built once he annexed Crimea. And the radicals, Limonov or Dugin, who is, sometimes called Putin's brain. Of course, he is not Putin's brain. He is a crackpot, although, it's hard to call him crackpot when he is on Fareed Zakaria on CNN, but still. For them, Russia is a continental empire for different reasons, and this continental empire should, of course, include Ukraine. And Dugin, he's not Putin's brain, of course, but whatever he said 20 years ago and was laughed out of the room, now Putin is saying it almost verbatim. He was also the first one to produce a map of partitioned Ukraine with the east and south called Novorossiya. And of course, now he's on Fareed Zakaria. Well, and those ideas became so hegemonic because they were not contested by the liberals that even the liberals themselves switched to talking about Russia as an empire. So Boris Chubais, one of the key figures behind Yeltsin's reforms, he was talking about Russia as a liberal empire. I have no idea what liberal empire is, and some abandoned liberalism altogether. So what we know is that and that's the last slide, in about 2007, 2008, pretty much everyone in the Kremlin was reading a futuristic novel called The Third Empire, Russia as it ought to be. It hasn't been translated to English, and for a good reason. And the author, by the way, interestingly, the author is a pretty prominent politician. He is the vice speaker of the Russian parliament from a liberal Yabloko party. And the story is Russia. So that's how the world looks like in 2050, right? It's divided into 5 states. So here is Russia with all of Europe, also Greenland, by the way. Yeah. So when I'm presenting, when I'm presenting it in the UK, they all look at the UK and Europe together and they like it to an extent. When I present it in Canada, they look at this and they're horrified. But more generally, how Russia becomes this, Russia is of course an autocracy governed by a Tsar. How Russia becomes this world empire? Well, it's easy. It defeats the US in a nuclear war with some Russian superweapon. But what's even more interesting is how Russian expansion begins. And it begins with Ukraine, a country, according to the book, and I love this quote, irritates the Kremlin by the very fact of its existence. And the story is this. The year is 2007. There is a political crisis in Ukraine. It's split between the pro-Western part, which also controls the government, and the pro-Russian East and the South. There are protests against the government in Donbass and in southern Ukraine. There is crisis in Kyiv, but when the government gets its act together and moves to crack down on those protests, the protesters and their leaders turn to Moscow and ask for help. The Kremlin sends the troops, defeats the Ukrainian army, also warns the US to not intervene because it will lead to a nuclear war. What happens next? There is a referendum. There is a new state called Novorossiya, which is immediately annexed by Russia, and then the rest of Ukraine follows. Now, if you know anything about what happened in 2014 and in 2022, that's exactly how the scenario went. And I know quite a few people who believe that actually people read this book not as a futuristic novel, but as a to-do manual. I wouldn't go that far. What I would say, though, is that, again, we see the same ideas leading to pretty similar actions in different regimes and different settings over many, many decades. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Great. Okay, good. So this is a great book. It really is. It reads extraordinarily well. It covers a broad span of history, and I'm off again. Quite efficiently, and it makes a convincing argument. Really, really enjoyed it. We're going to open it up to the audience pretty soon, but I wanted to ask a couple of questions before we do that. And it's
that one is almost done, but
all right. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, good. So these are both in the spirit of the origins of the book. So it seems that the popular discourse surrounding the war in Ukraine tends to focus, to the extent that there's any discussion of the causes of the war, the focus is on events of the last 25, 30 years, maybe at most. So the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, the Bucharest Declaration of 2008. What was it that encouraged you to go back in time so far? Why did you think that it was necessary to explore 200 years of history in order to understand something that's happening today?
Thanks. So there are two reasons. One is, analytical, and other is practical. The practical one was that, I wanted to write a book about the war, but everyone else was writing a book about the war. So my editor told me that I need to do something, go deeper or back in time. And I was stupid enough to agree to that because I had no idea what I'm getting myself into. But more seriously, it also keeps dying. Okay. More seriously, I think so. So, the last 25 years is, of course, it's my natural territory. I'm a political scientist, as you obviously know, because you are my advisor. So, and I'm more comfortable in contemporary stuff. But, when I started reading the contemporary Russian, publications, especially among the nationalists, all things started popping up. So some of them being reprinted, some of them, being referenced. And I just had to understand where exactly those ideas come from. They did not spring up from Putin's head, in 2022. They came from the Tsarist period. And I had to go back to this period to understand where exactly those ideas about Russian nation, Russian nationalism, and Ukraine as Western conspiracy, where do they come from? And once I started digging, deeper and going back in time, the continuity that I saw, the parallels that I saw were so striking. Then, I just couldn't make it a book about the last 25 years because it just not, I'm okay. Thank you. So if we want to understand, what drives Russia, but even more importantly, how we can fix that, we need to understand those ideas and where they come from.
So another piece of the origin story of this book is that there's a lot of you in this book, and to just pick up on a couple of pieces of that, which you may want to go into in more detail. You have a family history from this region. You grew up in what is today Western Ukraine, as you noted earlier. I did not know, and I've known you for a lot of years, and I should say I never thought of myself as your advisor. It just seemed like you arrived in graduate school almost fully formed. But I did not know the story of your great grandmother who got caught on the wrong side of the border between Poland and the Soviet Union in 1929, and yet was somehow able to continue to receive some sort of pension payment from the U.S. government by traveling periodically to the U.S. Consulate in Kharkiv. More recently, you found yourself, much to your surprise, in the sort of unbelievable position of having written a letter of recommendation for one of your students who turned out to be a Russian spy, somebody who was deep underground, I guess, and posing as a Brazilian at Johns Hopkins SAIS at the campus in DC. And these and other parts of your personal history come through in the book, and it's part of what makes it such an enjoyable book to read, but I understand them also to be an important part of the motivation for writing this book. And so maybe just talk a little bit about how you think about that personal history and how it informs the way that you think about and write about Ukraine.
Thanks. So, yeah, I mean, the motivation to writing the book is that I got so angry when, my former student for whom I wrote a reference letter for the International Criminal Court and who got a job at the International Criminal Court turned out to be a GRU officer. So for me, it was a decision, well, being a nerd, that's how I can fight back. So that's how I wrote the book. But more seriously, so I think, I'm trained to think about big structural factors and, these variables, regimes, those social processes, but essentially what we try to understand is, humans. So what I try to do in this book and my other work as well, as is to see how all those big social factors and all those horrible things which happened in the region and to the region affect ordinary people on the ground, and essentially what politics does to people in those extreme situations. And and my family has been part of this history for better or worse, and that's probably the only individuals I'm comfortable talking about the good and the bad they did, because I know that they will forgive me.
I think we're cursed today. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Okay, good. So there are many more questions I could ask you, but I know our audience probably has questions as well. And so why don't we open it up at this point? We have folks online as well as here in the room. Please.
Oh.
Hang on. We have a microphone that may or may not capture your words.
Okay. Okay, cool. So I have a question about kind of the connection between this book and your other interest, which is mass atrocities and mass violence. I haven't read the book, so maybe I'm wrong, but in the presentation, you sort of describe this continuity between selective violence and selective repression and mass violence and mass repression and indiscriminate, right? In terms of like thinking about Stathis Kalivas' work and stuff like that. So I was wondering if you were thinking about how the shift between those two things happens in the context of empire and how that relates to more of the other literature on mass violence.
So that's great. Yeah, it works. Thank you. So I think, yeah, I'm a scholar of mass violence. So you're absolutely right in that. And my starting point was to understand violence. So I think that, what we see in Ukraine is in many cases, well, I wouldn't go to say that it's unique because I don't know, the entire universe, but pretty exceptional. So for instance, I'm a genocide scholar by training, and typically when we talk about genocides, we talk about targeting of groups based on ethnic or religious or racial identity. I think this violence is probably the only one I know of where the targeting is purely based on national idea, where it doesn't really matter what ethnicity you is or what ethnicity you belong to, whether you're Russian or Ukrainian ethnically, which language do you speak, or what is your religion, where it's an attempt to destroy a national group. I think it's also pretty unusual in the sense that, the violence process switches from perception of brotherhood, so we are the same, to we are going to destroy them, we're going to kill millions if needed, we're going to put people in concentration camps, we're going to, anything goes. I'm also not familiar with any other cases where the logic is similar. So I was actually quite surprised, when I thought about this violence, took a step back and see what is it exactly a case of, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, because quite a lot of the violence that we see, not the violence of Mariupol, for instance. Mariupol doesn't surprise me at all. That's just how Russian military fights for decades. It's like, Grozny, Aleppo, Afghanistan, that's doctrine. But, places like Bucha, for instance, or more targeted violence on the ground or behind the front lines, I'm trying to understand it. I think, or my hunch, that it's revenge. But I think we still don't know enough about what exactly is driving those Russian soldiers. I would love to get into their heads and try to understand what's driving them. But I think what we see absolutely doesn't fit the typical mold of, the literature of Kaliva style, etc.
I'm just going to jump in here for a second. So I think you were maybe the first public figure to call what Russians were doing in Ukraine a genocide. And so for those who haven't seen that argument, the argument is repeated in the book, but maybe just tell us, for those who are outside of this field, why is it important to know whether this is a genocide or not?
Right. So why it's important? I think it's important to know what drives this violence, or what the causes are. It's not just trigger happy drunk soldiers going around town and shooting everyone. There is a logic behind this campaign. And again, I'm not talking about Mariupol. I'm talking about places like Bucha, or more targeted violence on the ground. It's not about NATO, obviously, and it's not about security. It's an identity argument, and it's coordinated, it's predetermined, and it has a very clear goal of destroying Ukrainian nationhood and Ukrainian statehood. Another reason that, why I thought it's important to use the G word is that I naively believe that it will make a difference in public perceptions, so in policy perceptions, especially in the West, and I was wrong. It made absolutely no difference, but analytically, I still think that if we want to understand the causes of the violence, we need to look at the attempt at the intent to destroy Ukraine as a state and Ukrainians as a political group, not an ethnic group. It's not an ethnic violence, but a national political group and a political identity.
I mean, we can argue about whether this was, whether there's any consequence of this or not, but the International Criminal Court does have an arrest warrant out for Vladimir Putin related to the abduction of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children, and that's an important part of the argument for this being a genocide. Okay, who else do we have over here? Gentleman here in the second row.
Sorry.
Mhm.
So this is ironic that 30 years from 1952 to 53 to 82, Ukrainians actually was on the head of Soviet Union. They did not speak Russian very well. Nevertheless, so-called Dnipropetrovsky Obkom, it's all Ukrainians were brought by Brezhnev. So do you think that Russian people were upset that Ukrainians supervised them 30 years and this is the revenge?
No, I do not, honestly. So it's, I mean, it's not just Brezhnev and the Dnipropetrovsky outcome. It's also, even though Brezhnev is ethnically Russian, and it's also Khrushchev, who was born in Russia but grew up in Ukraine, or Chernenko, who is an ethnic Ukrainian from the Ukrainian diaspora in the Far East. No, I think that in the perception of the time, it didn't really matter that much, as long as you accepted the structure of, Russian and Ukrainians being essentially the same people, and you can be an ethnic Ukrainian, but still Russians are at the top of the hierarchy. And that was also the story of the Tsarist Russia, where there was absolutely no individual discrimination of Ukrainians and or people from Ukraine. I mean, they didn't call themselves Ukrainians, but little Russians could rise as high in the imperial hierarchy as it could be, as long as they accepted that they are little Russians and they are the great Russians. So no, I don't think it's Russian revenge for being governed by Ukrainians in any way. And in fact, even if you look at the current elites, I mean, not Putin, but people around Putin, quite a few of them are either ethnically Ukrainians or come from Ukraine or have Ukrainian connections. It just it's not about ethnicity. It's about relations and hierarchy and where Ukraine belongs.
I should say, Professor Monica Nalepa, who I think is not here with us in the room, but is online, just sent me a text message which I received on my watch, and she wants me to understand that the International Criminal Court can only accuse if it's a crime against humanity, not genocide, that the burden of proof is much higher for genocide than it is for crimes against humanity.
Yeah. Sorry, and Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova are not indicted for the crime of genocide. They're indicted for crimes against humanity and war crimes of the forcible transfer of children. Genocide is not part of the indictment. So in that, Monica is absolutely correct.
Okay. Konstantin Sonin.
Okay, my question is more about Russia than about Ukraine. I wonder, what do you think, why it's so important for Russians to say that nothing of this is happening, that there are no atrocities, no one was killed in Bucha, there were no kids in the theater in Mariupol, and it both a crime in Russia, so the officials is very concerned to say this, and there is a huge grassroots, if you talk even to a normal person who is unhappy with the war, they would still say, no, Bucha was not happening, this was crisis actors and other things. So why do you think this is a part of this story?
Right. So that actually doesn't surprise me at all. It's a pretty general story of not wanting to believe that we are the bad guys, and accepting the consequences. You can look at it around the world. Any society or any military that perpetrated war crimes and crimes against humanity would have those reactions. You can go back to US and my life, for instance. So, I grew up in Israel, and you can look at Israeli society and the Israeli violence in Gaza and the absolute unwillingness to accept that. So on the individual level, it doesn't surprise me that people are reluctant to accept responsibility for horrible things done in their name. What I think makes Russia different is the extensive use of propaganda to not give even an inch of that. this complete denial, even though everyone who has experience in Russia, and you have much more experience in Russia than I do, knows that the Russian society is quite violent, and violence is absolutely normal in dealings between the state or the police and the citizens. So individuals, it doesn't surprise me. What did surprise me is the use of propaganda and this absolute denial. Honestly, I don't think I can explain it. I just don't know. And I don't think we will know until we get into the. So for that we need to get into Putin's head. I wouldn't want to go there. It's a dark and scary place. Sorry, Kostya, I honestly have no idea.
All right, I think we have a question or comment online.
We have several, so I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple. So the first is about Poland, which came up a few times in the talk and in your previous work. Is there a similar story to be told from the Polish point of view that might strengthen the argument that the current war is not the inevitable outcome of historical attempts to dominate Ukraine?
Okay, so obviously nothing is inevitable. I'm not sure I understand the logic of the argument. So it's an attempt to dominate Poland?
This is what's written, but I think maybe the pretext is that Poland also colonized Ukraine, dominated Ukraine,
right,
and has not engaged in a potentially genocidal war against Ukraine. So I think that that's the question.
Right. So Poles do play a huge role in the story from the very beginning of this idea of Russian control in Ukraine. It's absolutely correct that it's more about, at least at the very beginning, about Poles and the imperial government than about Ukrainians themselves. I don't think that Poland does play that much of a role in Russian thinking as of now. Politically, of course, it's a boogeyman. It has always been, it probably will be, but other than that, I don't think I have much to say on that.
Can I ask a follow-up to that question? So a common argument in political discourse in the US and in Europe to some extent is that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, then Poland is next, or Lithuania or Latvia is next. An argument of the book seems to be that Ukraine is different from everything else, that Ukraine, whether Ukrainians understand themselves to be distinct from Russia, is especially important to Russia, which would seem to suggest that it's not necessarily the first in a series of dominoes where if it falls, then some other, possibly NATO member, will be next.
So you're right, and every time I present the book, I will either get this question after the talk. Some people would come to me, typically either Poles or Balts, and say, "So we are off the hook? Are we off the hook? Should we stop worrying?" And my answer is no. You should not, because there are two processes here. The process that I talk about, the book is about Ukraine, which is absolutely essential for Russia, but Ukraine is an end, but it's also a means for something bigger. In Russian perception, and I cannot understand why, but to build something bigger, to recreate the Soviet Union, the empire, you need to have Ukraine. You cannot do it without Ukraine. Why? For mostly psychological reasons. So will Russia stop in Ukraine? Well, they definitely want Ukraine, but that's just the first step. And all those people are talking about going beyond Ukraine, whether it's recreating the Soviet Union or whether it's building a continental empire or recreating a Russian empire. In their view, Ukraine is the first necessary step, but it's not the end of the story. So the book is mostly on the Russian obsession with Ukraine, but there is another story here that goes beyond Ukraine, and it's for a different book. But no, Poles are not off the hook.
Okay.
Okay.
Another question
Another
online.
question is about the Holodomor and how it fits into your narrative. Was it an accident or Stalin's plan to starve Ukraine? If the latter, intentional, was it a strategy that eventually backfired? And I might expand the question a little bit to just ask how you think about the early Soviet period, I guess, in the larger context. Early, obviously, there's some emancipatory efforts to overcome these power structures in the 20s, but there's also very not so thinly veiled imperialism behind many of those attempts. So say a little bit about the 20s and 30s.
Right, absolutely. So there obviously in the book, there is a chapter on the Holodomor and the 1920s and the Ukrainization and why it fell. So the Holodomor does fit the story. It wasn't an accident, absolutely not. It was part of, again, a broader campaign to control Ukraine through different means, though, which started originally less from less driven by identity consideration, more of a national and regime security consideration, with Stalin being absolutely obsessed with, again, we're back to Poland, and the fear of the Polish invasion, and the need to control Ukrainian grain, but and the need to break the back of Ukrainian peasantry that still spoke Ukrainian and still hoped to recreate the short-lived Ukrainian statehood of the 1917, 1921. But we typically thought about the Holodomor as somehow distinct from the Ukrainization and the repression of the Ukrainian culture, or the Stalinist repression more broadly. But if you look at what's happening in 1920s, 1930s, there is an attempt, again, there are the serious attempt by the government in Moscow to win itself of Ukraine and create a different story of Russian-Ukrainian relations that also fails when Stalin comes to power. And we see two processes happening at the same time. One is the Holodomor, which is the starving of the peasantry, while the rest of the country, the cities, and the working class are relatively safe and are not starved. So destruction of the peasantry for regime security reasons happening at the same time with the destruction of the Ukrainian culture, the executed Renaissance, and the rolling back of the Ukrainization of the earlier period to destroy the elites and the culture, driven precisely by the idea that Ukraine is too important for the regime to be allowed to speak a different language, to be allowed to be independent. And there was a pretty serious discussion among scholars of the Holodomor, whether it was genocidal or not, whether it was, whether his goal was to starve peasants who simply happened to be Ukrainians, or whether the goal was to target Ukrainians who farmed land. And until recently, we didn't have good understanding of what was going on, but in the last couple of years, we have some amazing work produced by economic historians like Andrei Markevich, Natalia Naumenko, that shows that the targeting was explicitly ethnic. It's not just peasants being targeted. So it was also genocidal as well. And we do see the same, we do see the same mix of ideas. National security, Ukraine is too important for the regime. Regime security, opposition to the regime should not be allowed. And those people absolutely should not be allowed to speak Ukrainian, have an independent culture which does not speak Russian and does not look to Moscow as the big brother.
Great. We have one more question, but it's a good concluding question. So before we get there, do you want to ask anything else, Scott, or does anyone else in the audience have a question? No?
We have a few more minutes. So if there Okay.
Great. Well, I'll dive in. Okay. So this person has read Dr. Finkel's piece last month in The Spectator and notes that it concludes ultimately resolving the war between Russia and Ukraine hinges on the Russians' willingness to accept that they and Ukrainians are not and will not become a single whole. So sort of riffing on that comment of yours, this person's asking, what do you think will be the end game of the current conflict?
I'm not sure. So actually, I ended the presentation. I also have a slide and a chapter in the book about how it can be fixed. I don't know what the end of the war will be, and I also skipped the slide because how it will end, to some extent depends on how Trump woke up in the morning and what he ate for breakfast. So I'm not talking about that much, but I think right now we are probably going to see some sort of the freezing of the conflict. But my point is, and you probably understand it, based on my presentation, that it's not about NATO and it's not about territory and it's not about security arrangements. So just focusing on who is going to control this or that piece of territory, or whether Ukraine is going to be allowed into NATO, or what kind of forces will be there. It's those technical solutions are easier to deal with, but they do nothing to address the core of the conflict, and that's the idea, the perception in the Kremlin and among not all, but large parts of the Russian society that they have a right to dominate and control Ukraine, and the willingness to act upon this right. So if we really want to end this conflict, we need to change that through education, through culture. It's doable. I mean, it's hard, but it's possible. Germans no longer want East Prussia and Königsberg. Poles have given up on Galicia. So Mexicans, no longer want California and Texas. So those. Don't even get me started on that. Yeah. So it can be done. And we actually saw Russians doing the same in Ukraine and with Ukraine. Now even the Russian nationalists don't want Galicia. For them, Galicia is this weird, dangerous place populated by crazy nationalists. So they want Ukraine, but without it. But up until 1939, everyone believed that those people are Russians. So those perceptions do need to change, but I don't know how it's going to end, but I think for it to really end, the change should come from within Russia itself. It's not something that we can impose externally without defeating and occupying Russia, and that's obviously not going to happen.
Can I ask one more question? So in addition to your work on Ukraine and your identity as somebody who spent his early years in Ukraine, you are a citizen of Israel. You care deeply about and have thought deeply about what is happening in Israel today. Does understanding one conflict help you to understand the other?
I mean, and at least besides the general understanding that horrible things can happen in many different ways, no, I think those are largely different conflicts and different violences. Not that one is more horrible than the other. They're just different, with the exception of, and that I think something that we in social sciences tend to underestimate, is how important ideology and nationalist ideas about land and ownership are. We tend, you know it as well as I do, we tend to treat politics as more rational. And I also tended to downplay the ideological aspect of violence and politics, but in fact, I think we're getting to more and more ideological world, and both conflicts show how much ideology matters. It's just that in the Middle East, we assume that those people are different. They always be driven by religion and ideology, and Russians are somehow more strategic or more rational, especially at the top, especially people like Putin And now we're converging on the understanding of how nationalist ideas and ideologies are crucial in the 21st century.
Okay, good. Let's give it up for Eugene Finkel.